All right, if you brought a Bible, please open to Leviticus chapter 21. 21. It sounds really good to say chapter 21. It's a far cry from chapter 1 12 weeks ago. We're getting really close to the end. This morning our text is chapters 21 and 22 of Leviticus. We've been going through this for, goodness, like 3 or 4 months now. Our text this morning has to do with priests. And when I talk about priests, we're not talking about someone who gives a homily and presides over the Eucharist and takes your confession. We're talking about the ancient priests of Israel that presided over the animal sacrifices. Chapters 21 and 22 are all about the tighter regulations that there were on these priests against over the other regular Israelites. You see, in Israel you had essentially 3 different kinds of people. You had the common people, your bankers and lawyers and executives and blue-collar workers and everything like that. And then you also have the second group, which is the priests. And then out of the priests, you have the third group, which is really small. It's just one person. It's the high priest. So it's sort of 3 levels of this society in ancient Israel. And what we're going to read about in these 2 chapters, which we are going to cover 2 chapters this morning, has to do with the priest and the high priest and what was different about them than the rest of the Israelites. So we'll just go ahead and dig right in because we got a long way to go this morning with chapter 21, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the priests, the descendants of Aaron. A priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean by touching the dead body of a relative. The only exceptions are his closest relatives, his mother or father, son or daughter, brother, or his virgin sister who depends on him because she has no husband. But a priest must not defile himself and make himself unclean for someone who is related to him only by marriage. The priests must not shave their heads or trim their beards or cut their bodies. They must be set apart as holy to their God and must never bring shame on the name of God. They must be holy, for they are the ones who present the special gifts to the Lord, gifts of food for their God. Priests may not marry a woman defiled by prostitution, and they may not marry a woman who is divorced from her husband, for the priests are set apart as holy to their God. You must treat them as holy, because they offer up food to your God. You must consider them holy, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I make you holy. If a priest's daughter defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she also defiles her father's holiness, and she must be burned to death," which, if you remember from last week, being burned to death is not being tied to a stake, it's having molten lead poured down your throat, which is excellent. Verse 10. The high priest, so we're getting away from the priests now, the high priest has the highest rank of all the priests. The anointing oil has been poured on his head, and he has been ordained to wear the priestly garments. He must never leave his hair uncombed or tear his clothing. He must not defile himself by going near a dead body. He may not make himself ceremonially unclean even for his father or mother. He must not defile the sanctuary of his God by leaving it to attend a dead person, for he has been made holy by the anointing oil of his God. I am the Lord. The high priest may marry only a virgin. He may not marry a widow, a woman who is divorced, or a woman who has been defiled herself by prostitution. She must be a virgin from his own clan, so that he will not dishonor his descendants among his clan, for I am the Lord who makes him holy. Okay, we'll stop there. What we witness in the first 9 verses is all these instructions for how the priests, not the high priest, but how the priests are supposed to live. There's these higher standards of personal conduct for them in how they mourn and in who they marry. They are not allowed to mourn like the rest of the Israelites mourn. Because if I have a family member or a colleague or a friend that passes away, I'm going to go to the funeral, I'm going to pay my respects. But a priest can't do that unless it's for his own family, for his nuclear family. Nuclear family. Only for brother, sister who doesn't have someone else to take care of him. Now, why is that?
Well, we're told elsewhere in Leviticus and in other places of the Old Testament that to touch a dead body, or to stand over a grave, or to be even in the same room as a dead body, would make you ceremonially unclean. And so a priest is not supposed to be unclean. And so God says, don't do that unless, of course, it's for your very closest family, and then I'll make an allowance for it. So they have these much tighter regulations on how they mourn. And then we see, the shaving their heads or trimming their beards, those are acts of mourning. Those are pagan rites of mourning. So God is pulling the priests away from that. And then we see all these rules about who they're supposed to marry and who they're not supposed to marry. They're only supposed to marry widows and virgins, and it doesn't really matter as long as she's an Israelite, but she has to be a virgin. Why? Because priests are only from the tribe of Levi. Priests only come from this one ancestor, and so if they marry someone where it might call the lineage into question, God just wants to get away from that. So only virgins and widows. And then you get into the high priest, and the high priest has even tighter regulations because he's like the president of the priests, and he doesn't get to mourn for anybody. He doesn't even get to mourn for his own family. He can't defile himself even for his parents to go to their funeral. He can't marry even a widow. When it comes to marriage, he has to marry a virgin, and it has to be from his own clan. Why does it have to be from his own clan? Because the high priest is the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son of Aaron, the first high priest. And so if you marry a widow, well, what if she was widowed while she was pregnant? Well, then it calls into question lineage and who is the next high priest. So God says only a virgin and only from the clan that produces high priests. What we see here is that the priests have been called to this higher standard of perfection in personal conduct, and who they marry, and how they mourn. And of course, there are all kinds of other things like the kosher food laws of chapter 11 and discharges of chapter 15, and then chapters 13 and 14 with all the mold and mildew and rashes and all of that. That all still applies to the priests. But what we see here is that they're called even higher than everybody else to this even greater expectation of how they're supposed to conduct themselves. They're supposed to be perfect in their personal conduct. Now, we'll move on to verse 16. The high priest, I'm off a paragraph. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to Aaron, who's the high priest. In all future generations, none of your descendants who has any defect will qualify to offer food to his God. No one who has a defect qualifies, whether he is blind, lame, disfigured, deformed, or has a broken foot or arm, or is hunchbacked or dwarfed, or has a defective eye, or skin sores, or scabs, or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron who has a defect may approach the altar to present special gifts to the Lord. Since he has a defect, he may not approach the altar to offer food to his God. However, he may eat from the food offered to God, including the holy offerings and the most holy offerings. Yet because of his physical defect, he may not enter the room behind the inner curtain or approach the altar, for this would defile my holy places. I am the Lord who makes them holy." So Moses gave these instructions to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites. And we'll pause. So now what we see is that the priests have this higher standard of physical perfection. And when I say physical perfection, I'm not talking about Men's Fitness or Women's Health magazine. I'm talking about their body has to be intact. Broken bones, illness, disease, handicaps. These things would prohibit someone from being a priest. Now, everybody else in Israel, if they broke their hand, it might hurt, but they can still be a farmer. They can still work with the other hand. It doesn't prevent them from being who they are because their identity isn't tied up in physical wholeness. But as a priest, if you have some kind of physical malady, you don't get to be a priest anymore. You don't get to come and offer sacrifices on the altar and do what priests do. And so priests had to be perfect in their physical body. And yet there's this sort of ray of hope in verse, I think it's 22, where it says that if someone does have a defect, they still get to eat the offerings. What does that mean? Well, every time someone would bring an offering The priest who presents it would get a portion of that. So if I'm a commoner, I come and I bring, say, a burnt offering. I bring a bull, or not a burnt offering, bad example, peace offering. I bring a bull, and we slaughter it, and we put it on the altar. And the priest who puts it on the altar for me gets to keep one of the legs, and he gets to eat it, and that's how he eats. And inside the tabernacle, there's this table that has what's called the shewbread, which is sort of bread for God, and the priests get to eat this bread. And we haven't gotten to this yet, but at the end of Leviticus, we learn about the process of tithing, where all of Israel would give 10% of their crops they would essentially take it and just put it in this big pile, and the priests got to eat out of the pile because they don't raise crops. So that's how they eat. Israel feeds their priests. And so in verse 22, God says if someone has this physical defect, no, they don't get to come and bring offerings, but they do still get to eat. It's just that they don't get to be the priest. And so they have to be perfect in their physical body. Now, we'll go down to chapter 22. We're moving quickly this morning, getting through 2 chapters. Chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons to be very careful with the sacred gifts that the Israelites set apart for me, so they do not bring shame on my holy name. I am the Lord. Give them the following instructions. In all future generations, if any of your descendants, the priests, is ceremonially unclean when he approaches the sacred offerings that the people of Israel consecrate to the Lord, he must be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. If any of Aaron's descendants has a skin disease or any kind of discharge that makes him ceremonially unclean, he may not eat from the sacred offerings until he has been pronounced clean. He also becomes unclean or by touching a corpse, or by having an emission of semen, or by touching a small animal that is unclean, or by touching someone who is defiled in any of these ways. The man who is defiled in any of these ways will remain unclean until evening. He may not eat from the sacred offerings until he has bathed himself in water. When the sun goes down, he will be ceremonially clean again, and he may eat from the sacred offerings, for this is his food. He may not eat an animal that has died a natural death or that's been torn apart by wild animals, for this would defile him. I am the Lord. The priests must follow my instructions carefully. Otherwise, they will be punished for their sin, and they will die for violating my instructions. I am the Lord who makes them holy. No one outside a priest's family may eat the sacred offerings. Even guests and hired workers in a priest's home are not allowed to eat them. However, if the priest buys a slave for himself, the slave may eat from the sacred offerings. And if his slaves have children, they also may share his food. If a priest's daughter marries someone outside the priestly family, she may no longer eat the sacred offerings. But if she becomes a widow or is divorced and has no children to support her, and she returns to live in her father's home as in her youth, she may eat her father's food again. Otherwise, no one outside the priest's family may eat the sacred offerings. Any such person who eats the sacred offerings without realizing it must pay the priest for the amount eaten plus an additional 20%, which is a really standard number in Leviticus. The priests must not let the Israelites defile the sacred offerings brought to the Lord by allowing unauthorized people to eat them. This would bring guilt upon them and require them to pay compensation. I am the Lord who makes them holy. Okay, so in these 16 verses, there's a lot about eating. In fact, I would say it's all about eating. Who gets to eat? What do they get to eat? What state do they have to be in before they get to eat? And what we hear is that they have to be ceremonially clean. A priest who comes to get his leg of the bull and he's going to eat it, well, he has to be clean before he can do that. He can't have discharges, he can't have skin diseases, he can't have stood over a grave or any of these things. He has to be ceremonially, ritually acceptable to God. And then he can eat. So he has to make sure that he's using this gift that God is giving him correctly. And then there's this talk about who gets to eat it. Well, the family of the priest gets to eat with him, because if you had a leg of a bull and you were just going to eat it yourself, it would take you a long time. It's a lot of meat. And so the priest and his household would get to eat the meat with him. Well, then what qualifies as a household? What if you have a guest and they're staying under your roof? God says, no, guests don't count. Hired workers, employees, they don't count. But if you have a slave and the slave lives in your house with you, yeah, then they become a part of the family, which is interesting because that elevates the level of the slave. God has this way of taking slaves and making them more than they are. But anyway, slaves get to eat. And if they have kids, their kids get to eat. And so there's this whole discussion in these 16 verses of how do we take what God has given us, the food from the altar and the food from the tithing and the showbread from inside the tabernacle. How do we take all these things God has given us and use them correctly? Because there's a proper way to use what God has given us, and there's an improper way to use what God has given us. And so the priests have to be perfect in the stewardship of what God has given them. They have to be perfect in their personal conduct, they have to be perfect in their body, and they have to be perfect in stewardship. Now hold on with me because we got one more long passage here. One more area that gets discussed, beginning in verse 17. And the Lord said to Moses, "Give Aaron and his sons and all the Israelites these instructions, which apply both to native Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. If you present a gift as a burnt offering to the Lord, whether it's to fulfill a vow or is a voluntary offering, you will be accepted only if your offering is a male animal with no defects. It may be a bull, a ram, or a male goat. Do not present an animal with defects, because the Lord will not accept it on your behalf. If you present a peace offering to the Lord from the herd or from the flock, whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a voluntary offering, you must offer a perfect animal. It may have no defect of any kind. You must not offer an animal that is blind, crippled, or injured, or that has a wart or a skin sore or scabs. Such animals must never be offered on the altar as a special gift to the Lord. If a bull or lamb has a leg that is too long or too short, it may be offered as a voluntary offering, but it may not be offered to fulfill a vow. If an animal has damaged testicles or is castrated, you may not offer it to the Lord. You must never do this in your own land. And you must not accept such animals from foreigners and then offer it as a sacrifice to your God. Such animals will not be accepted on your behalf, for they are mutilated or defective. And the Lord said to Moses, when a calf or a lamb or goat is born, it must be left with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it will be acceptable as a special gift to the Lord. But you must not slaughter a mother animal and her offspring on the same day, whether from the herd or the flock. When you bring a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it properly so you will be accepted. Eat the entire sacrificial animal on the day it is presented. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. I am the Lord. You must faithfully keep all my commands by putting them into practice, for I am the Lord. Do not bring shame on my holy name, for I will display my holiness among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who makes you holy. It was I who rescued you from the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. I am the Lord. So, in this last section, we hear about sacrifices. What animals do you get to use for sacrifice? And God says, first of all, if you're going to bring an animal, it has to be male. But beyond that, it has to have no defect. It can't be blind. It can't have sores. It can't have problems with its senses. So it has to be this perfect animal, much the same way the priest can't have any physical defects. Well, why does the animal have to be perfect? Because I'm thinking, if I'm a farmer and I use a bull to plow my fields, then and I have one that has a short leg, I'm thinking get rid of that one because he's going to walk in circles, right? It's going to be harder for him to walk in a straight line. Or if I have one that's blind, then it's going to be hard for me to use that animal. So let's take the ones that really are of no use to me and let's give those away. Why does it have to be a perfect one? It's because if I give God those animals, then I'm basically giving him last pickings. I'm giving him the bottom of the barrel. And so who is more important in that relationship? I am. I've set myself up as though my needs were more important than God's laws. So I really need this animal. It doesn't really matter what kind of animal you get because you're just eating it or you're just having a sacrifice. We're just going to kill it. So why not leave the perfect ones for me? It's because you are not the center of your life. Does it teach us to say, I am not the most important person in my life? So the priests had to be perfect. Not only in their personal conduct, not only in their body or in their stewardship, but they also had to be perfect in their ministry, in their work, because the priests were the ones who were in charge of inspecting the animals to make sure that they don't have a defect. They're the ones measuring the legs of all the animals and checking to make sure they can see. I don't know how they would check that. I suppose there's ways to find that out. But they are the ones in charge of inspecting the animals. And they're the ones in charge of putting it on the altar. And so if the wrong kind of animal goes on the altar, whose fault is it? It's the priest's fault. You see, the priest acts as this sort of gatekeeper. Well, anyway, you have the priest that has to have a perfect ministry. He can't come into it half-hearted. He can't come into it and give sort of 50%. He can't have an off day. He has to be perfect day in and day out in how he ministers. So, the priest has to be perfect in personal conduct, in his body, in his stewardship, and in his ministry. Now, my question is why? Why does a priest have to be so perfect all the time? I mean, what's the point of that? I mean, nobody can really be perfect, right? We say that all the time. Nobody's perfect. And yet we see this over and over. The priests have to be perfect in this way, and this way, and this way, and this way. Why? I think we get the answer to that really clearly back in verse 6. In verse 6 of chapter 21. Let's take a look at this. They, the priests, must be set apart as holy to their God and must never bring shame on the name of their God. They must be holy. Why? Because they are the ones who present the special gifts to the Lord. Why do the priests have to be so perfect all the time? It's because they're the ones who give the sacrifices. The priests are the ones who are in charge of taking the people that are on the outs with God and bringing them in. The priests are the gatekeepers of the people of God. They are the ones in charge of taking those who don't have a good relationship with God, those who have been ostracized by God, and taking them back in and bringing them near to God. And so if a priest isn't perfect, then he's an outsider just like everybody else. And if he's an outsider, how can he bring them in? The priest has to be holy, because if he's not holy, how is he going to bring someone near to God? How is he going to make someone perfect if he's not perfect himself? You see, the problem is when you have people who are imperfect that are trying to make other imperfect people into something that they couldn't be in the first place. The problem is when you have some people who hold up a standard for others that they don't meet themselves. The problem is when we hold up a standard for others that we don't meet ourselves. Oh. Let me tell you a couple of places where I see this happening in our lives. One of the clearest ways that I see this is in the boss-employee relationship. I worked at Walmart a couple of years ago, spent a summer in the back at Walmart. My job was, I was a part of a team of about 8 people. We would unload the entire truck, sometimes 2 trucks a day, and we would sort all the merchandise that comes in on this 53-foot semi. And then we would take all the merchandise out onto the floor, and someone else would put it on the shelves. So it's the same job every day, day in, day out. Well, I had 4 or 5 bosses that would rotate based on who was working that day and what department they were over. And out of those 4 or 5 bosses, I had one that earned my total respect. Because you're talking about being in the back of a semi, moving hundreds and hundreds of pounds of material in Oklahoma. It's 100, 110 degrees. And you're not allowed to wear shorts at Walmart. You have to wear long pants. And so you'd just be drenched in sweat by the end of the day. And I had one boss who on the hottest days would get in the truck with me and help me unload the material. When he said, hey, I need you to do something, I listened. Why? Because he wasn't holding up a standard that he wasn't willing to meet. He was willing to get his hands dirty with me. So if you're an employer, on the other side of this coin, if you're the employer and you have people that work under you, and you hold up a standard for them of how much time or how much energy or how much creativity they're supposed to pour in, and you're not willing to pour in that same amount, it's going to cause friction. It's going to be difficult because you're asking them to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. Another area where I see this is parenting. What happens when you have parents who hold up a standard for their kids that we're not willing to meet ourselves? When we want our kids to be pure, but then we don't model purity. Or when we want our kids to be honest, but then we lie to them. Or when we want them to calm down, and we're doing it in a really angry way. We're holding up a standard that we're not meeting ourselves. Or let me stomp on my own toes here, because Macy's not quite there yet. So I'll stomp on my own toes. Church leadership. For those of us who are elders, the preacher, if you teach Sunday school, if you teach the little kids or adults, if you have some kind of form of leadership in the church, and you're asking people to pray, but you don't pray yourself, you're undermining yourself. If you're asking others to study their Bible, but then you're not in the Word, well, you're sabotaging yourself. You've cut your legs out from under you. And if you're a priest 3,500 years ago, and you say, you guys need to be holy, but then you're not perfectly holy, well, you've sabotaged yourself. Who are you to say we need to be doing this? And so God says, I need these priests to be perfect. Why? So that they can lead others to perfection. I need the priests to be good with me so that they can bring others to me. Now here's the thing that I need you to get out of all of this. If you're nothing else today, this is the part I need you to hear. You are the gatekeeper in your family, in your workplace, among your friends, the people that you interact with on a regular basis. You are the gatekeeper. The Apostle Peter tells us that we are a royal priesthood. You know what that makes you? A priest. Okay, let's try that again. We are a royal priesthood. You know what that makes you? Priest. There we go. And there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of take that, a lot of dimensions to being a priesthood. And one of those is that the priests are this gatekeeper between those who are outside of God and those who are inside of God. And you are that role among your friends and your colleagues and so on. There are people in your lives that don't know Christ. You know people who don't have any strong, clearly articulated faith to speak of, and they are looking for somewhere to plant their flag. And the only thing standing between them and a relationship with Christ is you. We are the last hope for a lost and dying world. And we are one generation from extinction. And so when we stop trying to minister to those people, and we kind of hope that other people will come along, we're undermining ourselves. So stop waiting for some other follower of Jesus to come and do the thing that you're not willing to do. Because when we say, I hope someone teaches them about Christ, I hope someone leads them to Christ, but then you don't do anything, what are you doing? Holding up a standard for other believers that you're not willing to meet yourself. Now this is kind of a tangent. When it comes back around to Leviticus, it gets a little sticky. Because what did we see in Leviticus over and over and over? You have to be perfect. You have to be perfect. Perfect in personal conduct, perfect in body, perfect in stewardship, perfect in ministry. Well, great. Then I can't do any of that. Because when I read Leviticus 21 and 22, I start thinking, so I have to be perfect before I can bring people on the outside. Who am I to be a gatekeeper? I got my own problems. Who am I to lead people to Jesus when I don't really have that great of like a spiritual whatever? Who am I to be the gatekeeper? Because I'm not perfect. And yet, in some strange way, that's the point. That we're not perfect. Do you know what perfect faith is? I love this. This is a paradox. Perfect faith is faith that realizes it's not perfect. A perfect Christian is someone who realizes they're not a perfect Christian. Because it's in our imperfection that we say, you know what, I need grace. And that's what it's all about. It's all about saying, you know what, I can't do it, I'm not good enough. I'm not perfect in personal conduct. I'm not perfect in ministry. I'm not perfect in any of these things. And you know what, I just need some grace. Perfect. That's where it was supposed to land anyway. So, Leviticus 21 and 22. Let me close by just giving you this. All that you are is all you can ask for. All you are is all you can ask for. If you are not holy and perfect and pure all the time, then you don't get to ask others to be holy and perfect and pure. But if you put your trust in a God who rescues imperfect, unholy, wretched people like me, then you can ask others to put their faith in that same God who delivers people like them. So may you stop trying to get God's favor by being perfect and being in this relentless, endless pursuit of perfection. Simply rely on grace. May you stop holding up standards for others that you're not willing to meet yourself. And yet, all at the same time, may you be holy because He is holy.